In Acts chapter 9, we see once again this guy named Saul, who is going to become Paul, and one of the most influential minds in the Christian faith. So here's his conversion story. It says, meanwhile, Saul, who was a Jewish leader at this time, was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers. So he went to the high priest and he requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any followers of the way he found there. He wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains. Remember, they'd been scattered all over the place after Stephen's death, and now he wanted to bring them back in chains, right? So he's going there to do that. Now, you can read this story for yourself, but it's his conversion story. Jesus appears to him. He says, "Why are you persecuting me?" Saul gets blinded, and then he ends up in Damascus blind. He's still blind there for 3 days. He couldn't eat or drink. And it says that in Damascus there was a believer named Ananias, and the Lord spoke to him in a vision. There's another vision. And he said, "Ananias," and he tells Ananias, you can read this for yourself, but he tells Ananias to go to this house where Saul is and to lay hands on him so that he can see. So interestingly, God's going to use another believer to open the eyes of Saul. Jesus could do it himself, but he wants to introduce Saul to the church. He wants to show Saul how he uses people to help people, right? And so he's going to send this Ananias guy. Ananias, by the way, didn't want to go because he'd heard about Saul, but he goes anyway and he does it. And he says to God says to him, "Go, for Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles, the non-Christians, and to kings as well as to the people of Israel, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." And so God tells Ananias right there, "Trust me, Saul's going to be a big deal. I'm going to use him to fulfill what Jesus had said in chapter 1, verse 8, that the gospel would go from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And Saul, is going to be a huge part of bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth." So Ananias goes and he lays hands on him, and instantly something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he regained his sight. He got up and he was baptized, and afterward he ate some food. So we see that he becomes a Christian. He gets baptized right away, and it says in verse 20, "Immediately he began preaching about Jesus in the synagogues, saying, 'He is indeed the Son of God.'" So what a change. I mean, he's heading out after talking to the high priest. He's heading out to persecute the Christians. Now he joins the Christians, and he starts preaching their message that Jesus really is the Son of God, because Jesus made it so clear to him. He revealed himself to him. Now you can read some more about what happens. He meets with the disciples and all these things. He ends up in Jerusalem. But we see then toward the bottom, it says in verse 31, "Then the church had peace throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, and it became stronger as the believers lived in the fear of the Lord. And with the encouragement of the Holy Spirit," there's the Holy Spirit again, "the church grew in numbers." Okay. So we kind of put a pin in the story of Saul for a minute, because now for the next few verses in the next chapter, we're going to pick up with Peter once again, and we're going to see how these all tie together as we finish Acts and as we get into Galatians. But it says in verse 32, "Meanwhile, Peter traveled from place to place, and he came down to visit the believers in the town of Lydda." And so we come back to Peter, and Peter heals somebody, and then he raises someone from the dead, and you can read all about that. But Peter performs these two miracles, and then it says at the bottom of chapter 9, "The news spread through the whole town, and many believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed a long time there in Joppa, living with Simon, a tanner of hides." And so chapter 9, we end with having met Paul, and then we see how Peter ends up in Joppa. And in chapter 10, we're going to pick up with this story, because we're going to see the gospel spread more and more. And Peter and the disciples and Paul, they're going to begin to realize how big of a deal this gospel was going to be. And so we'll pick up on that in the next chapter. But for now, why don't you go ahead and read chapter 9.